We have a lot of special guests, and I'm sure that there's some I do not know about, so I do apologize. But right here in the front row, I'd just like to introduce Second World War veteran Jim Parks of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, who actually our special guest today. And I just met Jim beside the M7, and he actually has stories to tell about seeing this thing in action on D-Day and thereafter. So thank you so much, sir, for you and your family coming to join us today. Also from the Royal Canadian Artillery, we have several special guests. We have the Regimental Colonel RCA, Colonel Grabstead, Lieutenant Colonel retired Bill Kalidrakis, Lieutenant Colonel retired Jim Brazil. Also, we have Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Chow of 7th Toronto RCA, Honorary Colonel 7th Toronto RCA, Claire Hugh. We have members of the Toronto Limber Gunners of the 7th Toronto. You often see them here during our shows with their 25-pounder and limber. And we have Ron Patterson, the chair of the Limber Gunners, and Paul, the treasurer, representing our good friends from the Limber Gunners. Also, we have the family, the Dunkley family from the Dunkley Charitable Foundation, who has made this possible. And also up in the vehicle, to add to the living history we do here, we have the Canadian Army Overseas Living History Association. So thank you to our honored guests, our VIPs. And to welcome you formally, I'd like to introduce Mr. Alan Duffy, the president of the Ontario Regiment Museum.
What an event. We get new vehicles added to the collection on a regular basis, but we've never had this many people come out to give a warm welcome to a new addition. This is amazing, this vehicle. I won't get into all the details of it. You're going to hear some more stuff later, but you know, it is in pristine condition. You could eat off the floors. It's fully kitted. It looks like it rolled off the line and it's going to the front. It's amazing. And the interesting part, Brad, where's Brad? Brad and I have been talking about getting a priest. He's been wanting one for a long time. Canadians traditionally used a, what is it? A sexton. It's difficult to say because it's always been tabbed. A sexton came along. Brad was interested in this kind of vehicle. He said, no, it's got to be a priest. So one came up in the southern states, maybe 3 years ago, Brad, maybe 3, 4. We sent a team down to check it out. And the guy would let us start it, but we couldn't move it. And we were a little suspicious about it. We kind of ran away from that deal. And then nothing else came up until this came up. This came from Belgium or the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken, over in Europe, people that do restoration, they had it in their own private museum. And this was the vehicle. We talked to Brad. Brad looked at it. This is the one. This is a priest. And we sent a team over to it. The people were very accommodating, and it was in an auction. We got this in an auction. It's not like you go over and negotiate, cut a deal, put it on a ship, and here it is the next day. It takes time, but the auction was rather different. And you'll hear some more about that, but I still remember us sitting there, and there's Jeremy at his computer in his office. He's got Brad and I connected through cell, like, you know, a conference call, I guess, on the cell phone. And he's trying to do this on the computer, and the computer's lagging, it's slow. It was a little, what's the term? You know, a little upsetting, or not upsetting, but you know what I mean? Like, well, what is it? How is it? Well, anyways, here it is. Here it is. And then the toughest part of getting it over here was getting the paperwork to get it on the ship to send it over. It's at sea about a week. It lands in Halifax. We got to clear customs, might be a week there. And then it might be 2-3 days to get it from Halifax to here, depending on the weather and depending on the mood of the Montreal police when you have to go through there. They see this. you know, they're always a bottleneck for some reason, but anyways. So, I won't go on and on any further. I'm just, it's a heck of an addition. I always say this, that we're different than other museums. This is the largest operating tank fleet, I'll say it, in the world. Well, there are museums that are bigger, but they only have a handful, if any, of the tanks that run. What you look around and see, if it's not under restoration, to get it running, it is running. So the thing I always say is we bring history to life. So here, this thing runs, it operates. I don't know if you turn the key, but you turn something, she starts and you drive it away. We were actually moving it and they got a little mud on the track. We had a team of, it looked like ants cleaning this all up so that it'd be nice for the presentation. But anyways, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Brad. And you'll hear from others later. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. It was a long road for the Dunkley family, but it was a bit of a hairy road. I think that was the word that you were looking for. It was a hairy road for me. I had purchased a couple things on eBay before. But being the person at the control station with so much riding on it was a little difficult. Actually, I had both Al and Brad conferenced on my desk phone because I had to use my iPhone to also be on the auction in case the building's internet went down, because this auction took place 2 days after that South Ontario wide blackout. You remember that? Let's talk about being a little bit nervous. I'm going to talk a bit about the vehicle, but I don't really want to take away from the amazing research and display that has been created to go along with this exhibit. But I want to tell you a little bit about the M7. The M7 actually served in all theaters of the Second World War, in the Pacific, in North Africa, in Europe. Actually, Canadians also used them here on the North American continent, in the Aleutian Islands, during the operation to get the Japanese out of the Aleutians. So it really has a lot of stories to tell that are across the world and touch so many people. It was produced and used by the United States and given to Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Commonwealth. Why is it called a priest? Well, the actual name of this vehicle, which doesn't really go well on the invitation, please come to the 105 millimeter howitzer motor carriage M7 opening event. So the British always gave vehicles a name, a nickname. And that's why if you look at all the tanks, you have names like Churchill and Sherman, etc. The British called this howitzer motor carriage M7 the priest, because the crew commander, as you can see waving at you there, that looks like a pulpit. And believe it, the markings that it currently has on it, I kind of found it funny when it arrived. The nickname of this tank is HE Padre, or High Explosive Padre. So kind of fitting. So that's why we call it the priest. Now, the priest started its story in 1942, and it was based on a smaller medium tank chassis, an M3 Lee chassis, an earlier sort of pre-Sherman type. And 3,489 of those were produced. So you can see how this vehicle made its way into armies, Allied armies all across the globe during the Second World War. But then we found that this particular vehicle has even deeper history than that and is actually even more exceptionally rare. Actually, the military experts who looked at this vehicle before the auction gave it a 4.5 out of 5 for rarity. And why is that? Well, in 1944, they decided to upgrade the M7 to the M4A3 Sherman chassis. And if you actually look at the bottom part of this vehicle, you'll see it's very similar to the M4 Shermans that are over there. And after this exhibit, you can go and compare that. So the earlier M7s were based on that smaller chassis, and then they were there's this new version that came out in 1944, March of 1944, and only 826 of those were built. So we go from 3,500 to 800 and change. But then it was found when they were restoring this, that this vehicle had another variation to it. It was actually upgraded to an M7B2, which was modified for the Korean War so that the artillery, the howitzer, could actually fire at a greater arc. And only 127 of those were ever made and upgraded. So although this has been restored back to the M7B1, think about the rarity and the stories of this actual vehicle. It is one of only 127 that were ever made and is now here in Canada for us to enjoy and to learn from. Obviously, then it has a greater Canadian story because we all know about the Kangaroo, the armored personnel carriers that were developed from the M7, and then other vehicles, other Canadian vehicles like the Ram, and the important story that the Kangaroo played in the Normandy campaign after the initial landings and throughout the rest of the war. Now, this particular vehicle was restored in the Netherlands by a company called BAIV. And this was their very first restoration. This is very special to them, and it was kind of sad for them to see it leave the country because this is the first vehicle that they actually restored that started their company. It was discovered in 2005 in a scrapyard in Germany, and restoration took so many years, it wasn't completed until 2014. And while it was being completed by BAIV, it actually switched owners several times. It was a Class A restoration. Takes a lot of money, and it was a bit too much for one owner. They sold it off to another owner. A second owner completed it. The vehicle then did the Nijmegen run twice. In the UK, in Europe, they have a special event that tells the story of, sort of the bridge too far, the Operation Market Garden. And this piece here that we see actually redid that run twice in Europe as part of 30 Corps in a reenactment to remember those veterans and to remember that campaign. We really don't know what its service was, where it went, and who it went with in the United States. It was built in December of 1944, this particular chassis. The 105 millimeter gun that was in it was built in the United States in 1943. We know that it saw service in the Korean War and that was then upgraded to the M7B2. Then it was given to France after the Korean War, which gifted it to West Germany, where it served until 1966. And we actually even have pictures of the different European armies and the crews that served on this particular vehicle. So it's gone around the world many, many times before it finally came here in Oshawa to Canada to its final home. And more about the story of the move here to Canada. BIIV had never exported a vehicle outside of Europe. And so we went to them and they said, well, before we can move it or anything, our government says you have to have all these documents. And we said, we can't get some of those documents because we're a Canadian Armed Forces Museum and we're exempt from this and that and the other thing. And they said, well, our office won't do it. So it was actually through a connection with another Second World War veteran, Trooper Don White, who lives here in Oshawa. And he's actually a member of this museum, but couldn't be here with us today. Trooper Don White once introduced me to the military attaché of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Canada. Great contact to have in this moment. And so I called up their office. They knew who we were. They had been at this museum, toured it many times. Actually had been some special guests at our annual Aquino Tank weekend. And they wrote a letter, which I'm keeping on file for future use, basically that instructed their home office to remove all barriers. So it's interesting that a Second World War veteran, his connections actually also helped us get this vehicle here. Long journey over the Atlantic. We got to send out a team to the Netherlands, to BAIV, to drive the vehicle, check out the vehicle. The guys at BAIV were here in 2019. They knew about our museum. And so they were so excited that a piece that was so close to them, their history, and that so much of their effort went into was going to a like-minded and friendly organization here in Canada. So that's just a bit of the story of this particular vehicle and how it got here. And it only also got here because of support from museum supporters and donations. And as you can see on the exhibit there, that it says that this is only possible, this vehicle and the exhibit is only possible because of the support of the Dunkley Charitable Foundation. So I'd like to introduce Brad Dunkley for some comments on what this vehicle means to him and whatever else he has to say. Come on up, Brad.
Well, thanks, Jeremy, and thank you everybody for being here today. It's wonderful to see so many people. I just want to start by thanking everyone who was involved in making this happen. And I'm not going to mention names because I don't want to leave anybody out. It really was a team effort, right from that auction that Alan Jeremy talked about. Like, could have it wasn't one of these going once, going twice. It was like we could have lost by $1. Somebody could have snuck in at the last minute and beat us by $1. So it was pretty stressful, but I'm so glad that worked out. And the members of the museum who went over and inspected the vehicle and did all the paperwork, it was a lot of work to make this happen. So I just want to thank everybody involved and give everybody at the museum a round of thanks. I also want to just share with you the personal connection that my family has to this vehicle. And you can see in this excellent display there in the middle panel, there's a picture of my great uncle George, who served in the 12th Field Regiment. And it was wonderful to meet Jim Parks from the Winnipeg Rifles today, who landed at the Mike Green Beach on D-Day with the 12th Field Regiment. And it was wonderful meeting you, Jim, and speaking with you and hearing some of your stories. I like to help tell stories about our history and, often parts of our history that are forgotten or overlooked a little bit. And even on the Facebook page, I saw a few comments, a few people were, because, he's got like 8,000 followers or something now. Somebody's like, what, this is a piece of American history. Why is this in a Canadian museum? And I think, there's not a lot of people that know the history of Canadian soldiers being lent these vehicles and landing on D-Day and using them, through part of the Normandy campaign. So it's really great to be able to tell that story. Unfortunately, my great uncle George, he was killed on August 14th of 44. There was a friendly bombing, friendly fire incident, unfortunately. But a little bit about George. He was one of 12. Grew up on a 50-acre farm just north of Sterling, Ontario, in a little place called Harold, Ontario. And most of his siblings served. All the men served in the armed forces, including my grandfather, and some of my grandpa's sisters did as well. The other thing I was going to share is I got to spend some time with my great uncle Frank, which is George's one of his younger brothers, and he took me and my dad to see the farm they grew up in, and I said, what do you remember about George? And he said that one of his best memories was that George helped him learn how to ride a bike. So I just wanted to share that. So and the final thing I want to bring it back to the museum here is that this is a really special place, and I couldn't think of a better home to look after vehicles like this that'll be here telling the stories of our country and of our soldiers who gave so much for us. Everybody that volunteers here, they're a family, they support each other, and they're all they're serving a purpose. They're on a mission to help educate our country, to maintain that connection with the military, and to tell our veteran stories. So it's an amazing place to support, looking forward to more acquisitions in the future. So thank you very much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Brad, and the Dunkley family for your support on this, and yes, your continued support of our museum. And also, just as Brad said, we were closed for a month. We're under construction. Tank museums are not clean places. So I do want to recognize the volunteers of the Ontario Regiment Museum who came out here and for 4 hours tried to make a tank museum floor as clean as it can be. So for the volunteers, thank you very much. So the vehicle tells its stories, and it's through the veterans that those stories come. And we're able to maintain those vehicles. But sometimes there are other stories that need to be told in a more professional way in modern museology. And that's why we have this special display that was also part of the donation. A lot of research went into it. A lot of connections were made. So I'd like to introduce two people, and we'll have some comments from Demeric. Demeric Depensier is a close friend of the museum. He's also a museum professional that we work with from time to time when we can. He and Bruce Chapman, who I hope is also here, the graphic designer, they've been working with us for several years. And after this, and you're looking at the museum, you might see last year's exhibit, the Worthington display that tells the story of the Royal Canadian Armored Corps. That was also done by Demeric and Bruce. But a long road of research, of finding the right parts of the stories to tell and what to highlight in a museum where people are going to read a few panels and what are they going to take away from that. So I'm going to invite Demeric up here himself just to talk about his experience in creating this exhibit and maybe some insight behind it. Mr. Depensier?
Put myself in a loop. I always start by saying this exhibit is one of the most fun I've ever worked on. So I'll put another quarter in the jar. It's happened again. But this has really been a fascinating exhibit because the timelines of it are shockingly short. So there were 5 Canadian regiments that used priests during the Second World War, 8th Field, 12th, 13th, and 14th Field, and 19th Field. 4 of those 5 regiments used priests for about 3 months. That was it. That was their entire combat service. They landed at Normandy, and by that fall, they were done. They'd switched back to little 25-pounders. The 8th Field in Italy, they used their priests for just over a year, and most of that year was spent waiting in camp, learning how to use the vehicles. They'd not been adequately trained on them in England. So you get a service career for this vehicle in several different regiments that is tiny by the standards of the Second World War. But going through the regimental archives and the stories and the oral storytelling, the amount of stories that surround these vehicles and the impact they had on their crews were absolutely tremendous. This is one of the first exhibits we've had where we were able to look at the specific use of a vehicle or use of it by crews from multiple different regimental perspectives. And we found, going through all the regimental histories involved, some really, really, I want to say, spectacular imagery that you don't often find in often fairly dry regimental histories. I can point to in multiple stories from multiple different regiments, people recalling the spectacle of seeing an entire column of about 24 priests all open up on one overflying German scout plane with their 50 caliber at once in the dark. Scenes of drivers under German counter bombardment with their priests on fire, the ammunition cooking off, hopping into the driver's seats and driving them away from the ammo dump so they could explode harmlessly out in a field somewhere. Scenes of priests engaging German Panthers at ranges of under 50 meters over open sites with mortar fire raining down, and then immediately having to do a 270-degree turn to engage the other German Panther coming over the hill behind them. Stories of priests being used for charges. In Italy, the 8th Canadian Field Artillery were using these as armored personnel carriers at the Malfa River when there was nothing else available. So they had soldiers hanging off the guns with bayonets on their rifles, driving over rivers, firing at point blank range with guys hopping off the tanks. Just incredible stories, and all from 3 months, and well, a little less than a year in one case. But this isn't just an exhibit about the priest. It's, of course, also an exhibit about the M7 Kangaroo, the first generation, the troop transports that these were converted into. And for that story, I am infinitely grateful and have to thank Bill Miller, the official historian and archivist for the 1st Canadian Armored Carrier Regiment. He was incredibly generous in this project. He allowed us access to one CACR's entire archive. Every single piece of material they had ever collected on the Kangaroo went into this exhibit, all of their oral histories. So we have some spectacular photographs that have never been seen by anyone before on display here. And the Kangaroos, again, also used for less than 6 months by a regiment of under 300 people. And they tell amazing stories as well, especially relating to Operation Totalize, their first combat use in Normandy. You get stories of drivers who had never driven a Sherman, much less an M7 Priest. They get 12 hours of training on a vehicle that's full of sand because it was converted on the beach using armor plating literally ripped off of landing craft. The Royal Navy were not happy about that one. They get loaded up with troops who have seen one of these once before for an hour and still haven't quite figured out how to climb in and out. And then they get lined up in a field with, give or take, 500 or so tanks packed into a square kilometer and a column about 100 meters wide and a kilometer or so long. The sun is setting and they're told, okay, you're going to be driving in the dark on a train you've never properly seen before, in a vehicle you've never driven before, with a crew who doesn't know how to operate it. Your vehicles are leaking oil. They've got holes in them. Some of them are still filled with seawater. And they go off and they set out onto this incredible nightmarish scenario where they can't see ahead of them. All they can see sometimes is the tail lights of the vehicles ahead of them and the tracer fire that the ACAC regiments are throwing into the air to delineate the edges of the battle zone. They couldn't mark them by radio, so you just had a line of tracer fire, and if you cross the tracer fire, you've gone too far. And it results in these incredible sort of hallucinogenic scenes of people discovering, oh, I've just driven my my M7 and the troops inside through a German armored regiment, and they haven't noticed us. Let's turn around very quietly and drive back and hope they don't notice us a second time. So just incredible stories, and all packed into this incredibly dense section of the Second World War. So it's an incredible vehicle. It's been a delightful exhibit to put together, and there's so much more than we were able to fit on these panels, but I strongly encourage you, take a read, take a walk around the vehicle. The Priest is a wonderful piece to have here, and we're so excited to show it off. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Demeric. Once again, fantastic job, well done. So that is the end of the formal part of this presentation. We are live streaming this to our Patreons around the world. Thank you for your support and for tuning in today. Everyone else had to actually be here in person on this rainy day in December. So, like I said, the museum is closed right now. We hope to reopen before Christmas, but maybe not until the new year with the new renovations complete. But since you're here today, please take the time to come up, see this new exhibit, see the other exhibits in the museum. The Static Display Museum is open. It's just to your rear there. Obviously, we can't let you out the front door because there's wet cement. But take this opportunity, if you haven't been here before, to learn about the Ontario Regiment, learn about the other incredible vehicles in this collection and their stories, and also to meet some of the incredible people who served on and around these vehicles and their stories. So once again, thank you all for coming. It's an overwhelming response. We're so happy to be able to open up today and welcome you here. And once again, thank you to the Dunkley Charitable Foundation for bringing this vehicle to its new home in Canada, where we'll continue to tell Canadian stories and international stories with this vehicle in the years to come. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.